Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and I have with me this time a special guest. I have Tim Dietrich. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Paul. Thanks.
Tim is going to be talking about something he calls temper. What a cool name. And how that can be used with FileMaker. And then afterwards, I'm going to show how you can use this temper thing with Xojo to get access to some of your FileMaker data. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. All right. So we're going to talk about Temper, and Temper is an alternative web API for the FileMaker platform. First, just real quick, I'm Tim Dietrich. I'm a software developer. I do a lot of different things, but at the moment, I'm specializing in NetSuite integrations and Promo standards implementations. For those of you who don't know what those are, NetSuite is a cloud-based ERP system, and Promo Standards is a standard for the promotional products industry that's kind of revolutionizing that industry. So that's kind of what I'm doing these days, and you can learn more about me on my site at timdietrich.me. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to explain what Temper is, how it's different from the FileMaker data API, if you're familiar with that. I'm going to demonstrate Temper by making some API calls, and then I'm going to hand this off to Paul. He's going to show you how you can create Xojo-based apps. He's, I think, got 3 different types of apps he's going to show us that use Temper to communicate with a FileMaker database. So first, Temper, again, it's a web API for the FileMaker platform, and I say alternative because there are lots of different APIs these days. Probably the most popular being, or growing in popularity, is FileMaker's own data API, which I'll talk about in a moment. With Temper, you can make API calls that let you work with records, perform finds, run scripts, work with containers, get information about layouts, all kinds of crazy things, and I'll show you some API calls in a moment that demonstrate those. Of course, Temper was built with Xojo. Otherwise, I don't think Paul would have me on here. So it's built with Xojo. The source code is fully accessible, so you have complete access to it, and it's available under an MIT license. So you can get in there, you can see how I did what I did, and tweak it if you want. Take it apart. That's kind of the best way to learn. And if you want to make changes to it, of course you can, and distribute it, and so on and so forth. So Temper, again, it's an API that lets you do a lot of different things. I refer to those things in the API as actions. And this is a list of all the different types of actions that you can perform. The left column is essentially getting data. You can get a specific record, any record, and so on. And again, I'll show you those in a moment. The middle column has to do with working with records, adding them, updating them, deleting them. And then that third column has to do with working with containers, and then some of the sort of meta functionality that it provides, giving you access to information about the database itself, which can be helpful depending on what you're doing. So the technologies that Temper was built on, obviously, I need a way to access the data in FileMaker, and so under the hood, it's actually making API calls using the FileMaker API for XML, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, why that's important. Again, it was built with Xojo, and inside of Temper, you'll find that there's a module called Allo Micro, which is essentially a sort of streamlined version of Allo Express, which is a web server module that I've released. The Allo Micro module is really sort of cut right to the bone in terms of what it can do. It is designed specifically for building APIs and microservices. XFM is also a module that I've released in the past. It is a Xojo/FileMaker integration module. I can really think of a better way to describe it than that. And it is actually the module that is sort of building, if you will, the calls that ultimately end up being sent over to FileMaker server. Those are the XML calls, and it gets the data back and transforms it into JSON, which I'll show you in just a moment. So that's kind of the technology stack, if you want to call it that, that I use to build Temper. So let's talk about Temper versus the FileMaker data API real quick. And I promise to get through these slides pretty quickly. There's not many left. But this is a comparison between Temper and the FileMaker data API and the differences. So in terms of the style of APIs that each provides, the FileMaker data API is a RESTful API. And for those of you who know what that is, great. For those of you who don't, look it up. The Temper API style is more of almost like a remote procedure call type of API, which, again, I'll show you in just a moment what the calls look like, but they're not RESTful at all. And I did that on purpose, which I'll talk about when I show you the calls. I think the biggest difference, though, is if you think about the FileMaker data API, if you're familiar with it, you know that starting with FileMaker Server 17, they've started to limit the amount of data that can flow through it based on the way that your licensing is set up. You have to kind of think about, depending on the volume of data flowing through your API, whether or not you're going to hit some of those limits and what that's going to cost you. Whereas with Temper, there's no limits. It's using the XML API, which doesn't incur any of those costs. Your only real cost is going to be the bandwidth to your server itself, meaning the actual physical server that you're running the app on. The other difference that I think is kind of important is that the FileMaker data API only works with FileMaker Server 16 and up. Temper will work in theory with any version of FileMaker Server that supports the XML custom web publishing API, which I went back and tried to figure out when that was first introduced, and I really think it started in 9. It's been so long ago. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to use Temper with FileMaker Server 9, and if you're running FileMaker Server 9, you've probably got bigger issues. But it is kind of important to know that if you're running on an older version of FileMaker Server and you're at a point where you need an API that's sort of powerful and flexible, that Temper may be a good solution or option for you. All right, so before I get into the calls, you're going to see that all of the API calls that I'm going to be making are HTTP posts, which is kind of interesting. Again, it's not a RESTful API. All of the requests and all the responses are JSON encoded, so if you understand JSON and know how to work with it, I think you're going to find this to be familiar to you. And all of the requests have a pretty similar format, regardless of whether you're getting data, adding data, running scripts, whatever, they all kind of look and behave the same. So I think once you kind of get your head around how the API calls work, you get a couple of them under your belt, then getting the rest of them going is usually, I think, a piece of cake. And you're also going to see, if you're familiar with the FileMaker API for XML, that the responses that come back from Temper look very much like the responses that you would get from making a call directly to FileMaker through the XML API. And then just because that's actually what's going on under the hood, and I'm taking the responses that are coming back and just literally transforming them into JSON. So if you've got some experience with the XML API, then I think Temper's going to kind of come naturally to you. So let's go to the demo. So I'm going to jump over to my browser. And you can download Temper from temperapi.com right there. Just going to go to downloads, download it real quick. It is tiny. Open it up. And it's just a zip file. There's a bunch of different folders in here. I'm going to go into the Xojo project folder and just open the Temper Xojo project. And I can't see my toolbar. I'm going to run it. And I didn't make any changes to it, no configuration changes. I'm using it right as it is, sort of out of the box. You can see that when I launch it, this is actually a console app that I've developed, but you could, if you wanted, take Temper and put it into a web application or even a desktop application if you are feeling curious about how to do that. You can see that when I started, it actually comes up and tells me that the server has started. You can get a little bit of information on how it's currently configured. The most important part of all this is that you can see the port that it's running on. And in this particular case, I'm running Xojo 2018 R1.1. So the app is running and is waiting for me to go ahead and start making API calls. Before I do that, now normally I would take the sample API or sample database that I've included in the Temper project. I've already got that up on FileMaker server. I'm just going to open it up. I'm running FileMaker server 17. I'm running it locally. So I'm just opening up the database just so you can see what it looks like. This database is one that I've used in previous demos and projects. It's just a list of Starbucks stores. It's probably starting to get a little bit dated. Just lists information about the stores and where they're located. There's a list view and a detail view, and there's really not much more to it than that. So this is just a bare bones FileMaker database, nothing particularly fancy about it. So I've got that running on FileMaker server locally on my machine. It wouldn't need to be local as long as it is a database that's hosted on a FileMaker server that has the XML custom web publishing enabled. Then you can use Temper to make calls against that database. One other thing before I leave FileMaker, though, I want to show you that in terms of security, I have an account set up that is just named XFM for the account name. It could be anything. And I've got it assigned to a privilege set of the same name. That particular privilege set just has the XML web publishing extended privilege enabled. And you can see the other permissions that I've given it. In this particular case, it's pretty much got access to just about everything, but you could certainly tighten that up and set up an account that maybe just has read-only access. Maybe it has access to specific layouts. It doesn't really matter, but it's FileMaker's own native security that will be honored when we start making the API calls from Temper. So if you know how to secure a FileMaker database, you can do that and then safely make Temper calls against it. So let me just click that there. All right, so I've got the database already on the server. I've got Temper running. I've got it in debug mode. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a little file that comes with the Temper distribution zip file, and that's a file that's for a program called Paul, which I've used in the past. This is a tool available only for Mac, unfortunately, but there are similar tools available for other platforms, and certainly, lots of options here. But basically, this is a tool that I use to make API calls and do testing of APIs. So that file actually ships with the zip file. But again, you could use any tool you want to make these API calls that I'm going to show you. Down the left-hand side, I've got the different API calls grouped by their type, and the first group is all about finding records. So when I click on it, let me show you what it's going to do. I'm going to make a post request, and again, I'm going to make it to my local instance of Temper. If I jump back over to Temper, you'll remember that it's running on port 8080. So I'm making a call to my local host, port 8080, and this is the payload that I'm going to send to the API. So let's just talk real quick about what I'm specifying in there. I'm telling Temper that I want you to make an API call to a database that's also hosted locally on localhost. I'm not running that database securely, so I'm telling it that the protocol is HTTP. If you're running your FileMaker server with a certificate, you probably want to change that to HTTPS. I'm telling it what database I want to make the API call against. Here's the account name and password that I want it to use to make the call. And here's the layout that I want it to use when I perform the action, which is to get a specific record. And in this case, I'm actually telling it that I want it to get a record with FileMaker's internal record ID of 12898. So that's not, I'm not actually doing a find. I already know that record ID, which I'll explain in just a moment. But I just want to show you very quickly if I were to run that, it's kind of giving it away over here, but if I run the API call, you can see that it comes back with a nice JSON response. Just move this over. So I mentioned earlier that the responses look very similar to what you'd see if you made an XML call. And so you're seeing things like the FM result set, the result set itself. It's telling me that one record was found, and because I did a get record, only one record was ever going to come back anyway. The record itself is actually right here. And you can see I've got everything from the modification ID. In other words, that record's been modified 5 times. There's the record ID that matches up with the one I asked for. And then here are all the fields. So you can see all the field names and the values. And notice that in this particular case, it's actually given me back a value for a field that's in the database that's a container, which is kind of interesting. Well, this will come into play in a moment when I talk about containers. But essentially what that is a path to FileMaker server that tells FileMaker server I'm looking for the contents of a specific container. So again, we'll use that in just a moment, but I wanted to show that here as well. If there had been a problem with the API call, you would see that reflected down in the error portion of the response. So for example, if I kind of whack the record number and make a call, you'll see that this time I'm not getting a record back because there is no record with that record ID. And you see that it comes back with an error, code 101, and that's actually a FileMaker error itself. So there you go. Let me undo that change. Make sure that that's still working. All right, so that's a get record request. I can also ask FileMaker to give me any record. Let me go into, I'm going to actually leave it like this for just a moment, but this particular call, I'm specifying pretty much everything I specified before, but for the action, I'm telling it to find me any record. Doesn't really matter what one it is, so I'm not specifying a record ID, and if I run that one, it just gives me a random record. In this case, it's record 8293. If I run it again, it's record 5997, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of interesting. I'll talk about the script parameters in just a moment. It can be kind of interesting, but I'll come back to that. So suppose I wanted to find all of the records that are in the database based on a specific layout. I can do a find all request, and there's a lot of records in that database. So you see it's 13,000 records. If I ask for all of them, it will actually return them all back to me, which is going to be a massive response. So what I'm doing in this particular case is I'm doing a find all records request. That's the action. And this time I'm going to tell it to give me a max of 50 records. And let me just shut some of this other stuff off. So what it's going to do is just come back and give me essentially the first 50 records in the database itself. Now, what I could do is paginate through those if I wanted to by using the skip function. So I could tell it to skip the first 50 records. In other words, give me the second set of 50 records. So I can do that. You see the response comes back a little bit differently. And of course, I can also tell it that I want to sort the records. So in this particular case, I'm telling it I want to sort the records by state in ascending order, and then subsort the records by city in descending order. So if I run this, I think we'll see the records show up. I'm going to tell it not to skip, but I think we'll see records for Alaska show up first. Go ahead and run that. And there they are. It's kind of hard to see these because of the way that they're displayed, but you can see that here's a store from Alaska and another one and so on and so forth. So they're they're sorted by state and then again subsorted by city. So that's why we're seeing Wasilla, Alaska, their stores first. So you do have the ability to sort records, to specify the maximum number of records you want to get back, to skip records, so you can do pagination if you understand that concept. So a lot of power there. So that was a find all request. Another obvious need is to be able to find records based on criteria. And in this particular call, I'm doing a find records request. That's the action that I'm specifying. going to keep the max and skip disabled this time, but keep in mind that you could run those or specify those if you wanted to paginate through these results. But then what you do for a find records request is you actually tell it what the requests are. Like, for example, I've got 2 requests in here. The first one, I'm telling it that I want it to find records that meet the criteria that I have in here. So for example, I can tell it, if I check these 2 boxes, find me all the records that are in Richmond, Virginia. If I run it, little toolbar gets in the way there. What did I do? There we go. So these are all records, or all stores rather, that are in Richmond, Virginia. And then if I wanted to, I could tell it to give me all the records that are in Virginia. If you're wondering why I'm clicking funny, I can't quite see the little button there. It's underneath the Zoom toolbar. So anyway, that time I told it to give me all the stores that are in Virginia. You can see it came back with a record count of 420. So if I were to scroll down through there, you would see 420 different stores. So suppose I wanted it to tell me all the stores that are in Virginia, but I wanted to exclude the ones that are in Richmond. I could create a second request here, tell it to omit the records that meet these criteria, this particular criteria, and that is, again, City of Richmond. If I go ahead and run that, remember that the found count before was 420, so whatever we get back this time, you can see it's less. So it has taken out, was it 35 or so stores that are in Richmond, Virginia. And of course, I can combine everything that I've just shown you. I can tell it to do that request and sort the records. I can tell it to give me a maximum of 25 records. So with these parameters on the API call, you can really do a lot of different things. It's really kind of neat. If I tell it to skip, say the first 10 records, for example, I could do that. So you could mix and match the parameters and really do just about anything that you would need to do to present or give access to records through the API. This tool in itself gives us a nice, easy way to look at or build up an API request. But if you want to see what it looks like in terms of text, I think I have one of these disabled. This is what that request currently looks like under the hood. And with the temper files, there's actually it's actually a text file, but if I open this up, you can see that here are all those calls that I have over in Paul. It's showing you how to do them with the curl command. So that can also be helpful to you. All right, so we looked at getting records, finding records. I'm going to skip this other example because we don't really need to look at it. Let's suppose that I wanted to add a record to the database. That's actually extremely easy. All the same parameters for the most part I'm specifying here. In this particular case, I'm telling it that I want to use the layout store details, which is that layout that's really designed for a single record. Really doesn't matter which one I want to use at this point. And then I can tell it that I want to do an insert record command or action. And then I just specify the fields that I want to set. I specify the name and the value. And if I were to run this, let's give it a different name here. We'll call it webinar test. If I go ahead and run it, see, it actually comes back and tells me that it has created, was successful. It gives me a 200 response. And then it actually shows me the record that it created. It tells me what the record ID is and all that good stuff. If I jump back over to FileMaker and do a find for webinar for the store name, there's the store that we created. So you can see it really is there. So I'm going to grab that record ID. And I'm going to go to my update record example. And in this particular case, I'm going to do an update record request. I'm going to specify that number that I just grabbed from the other record that we created. And I'll call it webinar store updated. And I can even update the store ID, which is not the record ID, it's just something else. We'll just call this test. I can specify as many fields as I want to update or as few. And I'm going to go ahead and run this command. If I jump back over to FileMaker, you can see that the store name has been updated as well as the store ID. So that's the update record command. And then if I want to delete the record, it's just a simple matter of making a delete record request and specifying the correct record number or record ID. So I'm going to run this. In this particular case, the response comes back 200 OK. It doesn't have any way to show you the record that it deleted, but it really is gone. And to prove it, if I jump back over to FileMaker, you see the record is now gone from the database. So that is manipulating records, inserting, updating, and deleting. Let's talk quickly about containers. So I have a store in the database, or a record in the database that actually has a photo in a container. So let me get record 12.898. Let me see what one that is real quick. It was actually this one. So it's a store ID. Let me just grab it. So this is that store that I'm going to try to get the value of the container out of. So you can see it's got a logo in there in that particular container field. If I go back over to Paul and I do a get container request, this is the command that I ran to get the record itself back. And remember earlier I mentioned that that photo, the value that it's showing me when I do a get record is actually a path. If I take that path, which I've done there, and put it into the container URL, it is the same path that's just been decoded. If I run this, it will actually give me back the image. There it is right there. So it's bringing back the contents of the container based on nothing more than that container URL. So that's doing a get container. Now, setting a container is a little trickier in that you have to have the contents that you want to put into a container somewhere in a place where you can make an HTTP call to get it. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to first go over here and delete the container contents. So this is that same record that we just looked at. I just removed the file. I'm going to run a get record request. I'm going to specify the ID of that record. And I'm going to tell Temper to tell FileMaker that I want you to actually run a script for me called photo container set and pass along this particular parameter, which happens to be a URL to an image. Pull that up. And that's the image that we're going to tell it to grab. So if I go into FileMaker and show you that script, there's really not much to it. All it does is an insert from URL, and it's going to use the script parameter that I am sending along with the API request. Let me just close that down. And if I actually go ahead and make this request, you can see that it has, you can tell right away that it has actually replaced the contents of the container. It's giving me the path once more to the contents. And if I go to the database, you'll see that behind the scenes, it's actually FileMaker server that has reached out using that URL, grabbed the image, and stored it in the container. So again, the catch with this is that the file has to be somewhere that you can get to it from a URL. So you're going to have, if you've got some kind of an application where users are uploading content and you need to store that in a container, you need to give them a place to upload it first. One of the tools I use quite a bit, or technologies I use quite a bit, is FileStack. It's a great way to present users with a nice upload form, and it'll store the files that are uploaded and give you a URL to them, and then you could actually make the Temper API call to grab those files that have been uploaded and store them in the database. So those are the two container-related API calls, and I'm almost done here. These last calls are, I kind of refer to them as meta calls. If I run them, they'll actually come back and tell me information about the database itself. In this particular case, it gives me back a list of the layouts that are in the database. So even if I don't actually have FileMaker Pro and I want to kind of probe the database that I'm going to be making API calls against, I can use these kinds of calls to start to get some information about that database. You know, the names of the layouts. I can actually specify a layout and do a get layout view, in which case, without me actually running it, you can see it'll come back and tell me a lot of information about the database and the layout that I specified. So for example, all the fields that are on that particular layout, the type of field that they are, you know, are they text fields or are they radio buttons and so on? Are there value lists involved? I can also run a get script names command, and you can see the results of that are right here. There's only one script in that database, and it's the photo container set script. So while I don't really know what the script itself is or what it does, I can see what the names of the scripts are. And then you can also get value lists as well. So it's very similar to the get layout view in that the get value list action only brings back the value lists that are in use on the layout that you specified. So you can see in this particular case, there are actually two value lists that are used. One is for the cities. You can see there's 3,062 values for that. And then one for the states. So we've got 51 of them there. And so that's the database information. Let me jump back over to my slides. All right, so a couple of takeaways and things to think about before I get to taking some questions. But the takeaways, I think, are that I think you saw that it's pretty easy to use in terms of how you make the API calls and the structure of them. I think they're very FileMaker-like in that if you understand FileMaker, I think you'll get a sense of why it's asking for what it's asking for. Again, there's no need to worry about the data transfer limits. Behind the scenes, all the calls that were going between the Temper app and the FileMaker server were actually XML calls. So we don't have to worry about the data transfer limits. If you've got say you've got a popular mobile app or some kind of a web application that's hitting FileMaker on the back end, no real need to worry about the data going in or out. And something else to consider is that developers can use whatever tools they want to make these calls against Temper. Paul's going to show you how to make calls using apps that are built with Xojo, but you could really use just about anything. Any tool or any technology that can make basically an HTTP call can make a call to Temper and get the data out of FileMaker. And the data coming back in JSON just means that it's that much easier potentially to work with. So a couple of things to remember. You've got to have the XML custom web publishing enabled on your server. There's a note on the Temper website about how to turn that on with FileMaker Server 17. It's a little bit tricky because of the changes to the admin console. Also remember that whatever account you're going to use to make the Temper API calls you've got to have in FileMaker, that account has to have the XML privilege enabled. And this is something I didn't really talk too much about, but the layout that you specify when you're making the API calls is important. It's important because it will determine what the underlying table is that you're actually accessing, whether you're adding, changing, deleting records, or getting data from the table. And it also determines what fields are available to you, whether you're setting them or getting field data back, because only the fields that are on that layout will be returned in your API calls. So just remember that the layouts matter. And then just a few best practices, things I recommend. You really should try to run Temper with HTTPS. In other words, get a certificate if you're going to put this out somewhere. We've been having a lot of luck with Let's Encrypt. It's a great way to get certificates for Xojo-based apps. And also consider running the Temper app behind a proxy server, for example, Nginx. And I say that because you can kind of take some of the load off of your Temper app and put it on something like Nginx. You can let it do the SSL termination. In other words, let it handle the certificates. You can use it to do load balancing. So if your app or your API gets popular, could load balance instances of Temper behind the proxy server. And you can also do things like rate limiting. For example, you can limit the number of calls that any particular IP address, for example, might make against the app. So if you're afraid that someone's going to just kind of beat up your instance of Temper and potentially, take a load or start to put load on your FileMaker server, you could use something like Nginx to help, mitigate that to some extent. I think that's all I've got. I'm going to take a couple of questions here, and then I'll hand it over to Paul. Let me see what the questions are. So Edwin was asking, is there a way to include OAuth, for authentication? I haven't tried to do that yet, but I think you could probably tweak it to actually make the authentication that way. I'm not sure if you can actually let FileMaker server itself do the external authentication on its end, but I imagine that you could. It's a very good question. I haven't tried that myself. Ruben asked, this may have been answered in the first minutes, are there any advantages to using the new FileMaker Data API rather than Temper? So again, we go back to this particular slide where I compare Temper versus FileMaker Data API. In terms of the styles, they're very different, but I think the real key differences are that the Data API has limitations in terms of the amount of data that can flow through it, whereas Temper, because it's actually using the XML API, it doesn't have those restrictions. You don't have to worry about bandwidth or hitting some kind of a data cap. The other big difference is that the FileMaker Data API is only supported in FileMaker Server 16 and up, whereas Temper will actually go back to, I've tested it all the way back to 12, but in theory, it can go all the way back to 9. Any version of FileMaker Server that supports XML custom web publishing, in theory, should work with Temper. I don't have a FileMaker Server 9 available, so I think that's it. Are there any other questions before we move on? All right, so Paul.
Looks like there was a question in the chat, Tim, if you see that.
Oh, okay. You call a script that returns a value. Can you get that value? Yes, sort of. So the question is, if you use Temper to call a script and that script actually returns a value, is there a way to have that value returned back as part of the response? You can do it, and it's a little bit tricky. What you essentially do is you create a global variable and put the value of the script, the script response in the temp variable, and then it will actually flow back through the Temper response. And because it is short-lived in that the global really only applies to that particular call, it's not like it persists in the database. It is as if somebody went into the database, ran a script, the value got stuck in a global variable, and then when they logged out and logged back in, it was kind of reset for them. So I hope that answers the question. Are there any other questions before we move on? All right, so if you've got any other questions, or if you want to download Temper, it's available at temperapi.com. And Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, I'm going to try and grab the screen here. Let me. All right, I think I got my screen up now. And what I'm going to show you is how to use this Temper tool with Xojo. So you can pull back the data and display it in a Xojo app. So if you don't already have Xojo, you can head over to xojo.com, click download. I think you got to create a quick account. You can download it for free. Xojo is kind of an unlimited trial kind of thing. So you can play around with it and run it without any time limits or anything like that. You only need to purchase Xojo when you want to compile and build your apps. So if you wanted to build Temper to deploy it on your own server, you'd need a Xojo license. But otherwise, you can download Xojo and play around with it. I am running FileMaker Pro server and Temper itself in a virtual machine. Tim helped me set up FileMaker. Surprisingly, I'm not really all that familiar with it. But it's running up in here, so that's how I'll be connecting to it. And what we're going to look at here is just one particular API call, the one that Tim showed, find all records. And as he showed, this is going to pull back some data right from the FileMaker server. And in this case, about 50 rows is what we have specified. You notice I have a slightly different IP address entered here because that's the IP of the virtual machine that I'm running Temper on. So what we're going to do is essentially map this call in a Xojo app. And we'll look at, I'll show you how to do this in a desktop app real quick, and then we'll look at how it also works in iOS and a web app, so you can see how similar they all are. So I'm gonna do right now, Xojo's running. I'm gonna create a new desktop project. Actually, I want to call it Starbucks Desktop. And this will be pretty simple from a UI standpoint. So what I'm going to have here is just put a list box here. We're going to show some of the data that comes back regarding those Starbucks stores. So we'll put a big old list box here. And then I'm going to just add a button here that will essentially call Temper. So we can have that be the load data button. On the list box, we'll just show a few columns. So I'm going to go with 4 columns. We'll turn on the heading. I'll give them some headings. So we've got just some initial UI set up here. Now what I'm going to do here is I actually have pre-built this project, but I'm going to steal 2 parts from it that I'll show you how they work in a second, but I'm just going to copy these 2 classes over. And these 2 classes are very simple. This one here is just an empty class called store, which represents a Starbucks store. And it essentially just maps to the FileMaker table. So it has all the fields, the columns in here as properties. They're all text properties. There's no code or anything on this. This is just essentially a way to contain the data. And then the Starbucks Temper class is a implementation of Xojo's HTTP socket. And this is what is responsible for calling the Temper API, sending it the data, that JSON data in the post, and then getting the data back, and then parsing it out and sticking it into a store array so the rest of the app can use it. We'll look at the code that's in there in a moment, but assuming that's built, you can see how you can use that in your Xojo app. So you can just drag this thing here onto the window, and this gives you a little controller here. And then we can add the minimal code to the Xojo project. So I'm going to add an event handler to the button. And on that Starbucks class, there's a method called getAll that maps to that API that Tim has implemented in Temper. And you can pass it in the maximum and the number of rows you want to skip. So I'm going to tell it I want to get the first 50 rows from that table. So that's the only code I need there to kind of kick off the call to Temper. And then here on the Temper thing, if I look at the events here, there's an event called results returned. And this event's called when the API sends the data back. And it passes it in as just an array of stores. So I can, so that we can call it multiple times, I can just make sure the list box is, we delete everything that's in it. And I can just add the data I want into the list box. So we want to grab those 4 columns from the store class that were copied in. And that's kind of it. If I remember correctly from what I was doing. So if we go back here, I can just tap run. And you can see it pulled back the data that's in here. And I can use the list box to interact with it and sort it and do what I want. So that's how you can use that once you've built your little interface class. So what does the code that's in this actually look like? Well, there's not too much. You saw the getAll method call that I made. And this one here, you can see here, this is like, just about 40 lines of code. This is just setting up what you saw in PAW. So it's setting up the body that needs to be sent along in the post. So all the values here, or what you see here. So it is just doing that by putting all that information in a Xojo dictionary. So nothing really complicated here, just assigning the values to dictionary using the name and the value. And it's setting it all up to match what how Tim's temper has the protocol defined. And then it just converts that dictionary object into some plain text so that it looks again like you'd see here. And then in order to post it, that's converted to actual data, so a memory block, and then it is added to the content, and then you actually call the URL where temper is running. So that's it. That's all the setup. No matter which API call you were using, you would just tweak the dictionary setup code to provide the information the same way it's specified in the PAW app for when you're testing. And you might have different method calls for the different API methods that temper supports. And then the page received event of the Xojo socket is called when the data comes back from temper. And here this kind of does the reverse. The data comes in as in binary format. So it's first converted down to text and then converted back into a dictionary. And then essentially we get to the part of the dictionary we want. So if you go back to the result set here, you can see how this kind of, I can get both of these on the screen at the same time a little bit. You can see how we want to get down to here, this record entry, to start getting the information. So we just kind of grab the sections of the dictionary till we get what we want. And then when we get the records, we can loop through them all. And I'm just creating an array of that simple store class with the values I want. And that's what gets passed up the chain to the window. And that's it. Now, the cool thing about this particular implementation with this is that these two classes can be used as is in other types of Xojo apps. So if I switch over to, say, iOS, you can see right here, the store class and the temper class are in the iOS app. These are the exact same ones that are in the desktop app. The only difference for your iOS app is some of the layout, of course. iOS here has a table, and then it has a button that's in the nav bar. And you can see, though, that the code behind that looks pretty much the same. The code for when that nav bar button is pressed still calls getAll. And the code for when the results comes back in, very similar also. It's just making sure the table's empty, adding a blank section, and then looping through and adding the data. So you can see when you run that, what that looks like. And you've got your data in your scrollable table. And I set this up with the store name here and then the city state and the smaller text below it. So pretty much exactly the same. And then if you look at the web project, very, very similar to the desktop project. There's a list box here on the web page, also set with 4 columns, and a button and the load button has exactly the same code as the desktop app. And the results returned also has exactly the same code as the desktop app. And of course, these are also sharing those two same classes. So when I run this fires up in the web browser and also works exactly the same way. And that's it. That's how you can use Temper with Xojo. Nice thing about the way Tim built this is, it's pretty easy to work with. All right, I'm going to switch over here and imagine there's some questions. So let's see if I can find them. Here they are. All right. I'll take Edwin's first since I think I can answer that. Is it possible to use the image returned by the API? Yeah, totally. The image is going to come back as a HTTP binary data request, and you would just need to convert that binary data to a picture. Xojo has built-in commands for that. If I were designing this to map all of Temper, I probably would have maybe a couple socket implementations. So I might have a Temper one for the retrieval. All the retrieval commands would be in their own socket. All the update commands might be in their own socket. And then maybe those container commands would probably be in their own socket. So I'd have 3 different sockets. But they'd all be implemented pretty much exactly the same as this one, as far as how you set up the JSON payload and then parse it when it comes back. Or in the case of an image, you're not getting JSON back, you're getting actual binary data. So you would just grab that directly, convert that to a picture, and use it. But yeah, that would work fine.
All right, so Paul, you want me to take that other one?
Yeah, I don't even know that I could answer that. Yeah.
Okay, so Luke is asking, what's the advantage of using Temper or even FileMaker's data API compared with doing it through an ODBC link? There's, I guess, a lot of, I don't know, advantages, but differences for sure. For example, with what Paul just showed with that particular iOS app, there would be no way to create an ODBC connection from an iOS app, at least none that I know of, an ODBC connection from an iOS app to a database like FileMaker. So that's one. And then just secondly, I think that in terms of sort of the direction that the industry is going in, we're getting used to consuming data and interacting with databases via APIs, and for a lot of different reasons. Once you get familiar with how APIs work, I think consuming the next one gets that much easier. So I don't know that I really have answered your question well. From a technical standpoint, you might get better performance with the ODBC connection. It's going to, I guess, really depend. One of the things I didn't mention while I was going through the Temper demo is that Temper can live and be hosted somewhere completely different from FileMaker server. In all of our demos here today, our instances of Temper and FileMaker server were local to our machines, but in production, that's probably not going to be how it is. Like, for example, I've got instances of Temper that are running on EC2 servers that are hitting FileMaker servers that are not even in the cloud. So that's another advantage. I don't really have to worry about keeping the things near each other and trying to, deal with latency and so on. So I hope that answers the question. But if not, feel free to email me and talk more about that.
Well, now that I understand that question, Tim, I will add a couple thoughts on that. First of all, I mean, the ODBC connection, just in general, I was unaware that FileMaker had specific ODBC connections, but that's always a direct connection, right? So you got to maintain some sort of live connection. If you lose your connection to the server, that's probably generally bad. It is in all other ODBC type things I've used. Whereas something like Temper or other web-based things like this are generally stateless, so they're a little more resilient.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Paul. And again, too, I think, just from a standards standpoint, we're starting to get to a point where that, again, consuming data, working with data we're getting used to, I think, to doing it, through APIs, whether they're RESTful or not. So, which is a good segue into the next question that came up, which is what's the downside of, say, an RPC style API, which is what Temper is, versus a RESTful API. One of the reasons I set out to create Temper as an RPC style API was it just seemed to me to be easier and more straightforward. It wouldn't be difficult to have implemented it with it being a RESTful API, but the calls would have started to look, I think, different and weird. It was just, to me, it was more straightforward from a code standpoint. not only in developing Temper itself, but in making the API calls for everything to pretty much just be a post that hit the API and then have everything that's in the body of the request kind of specify to Temper what it is that you're trying to do. Everything from what database you're hitting, credentials you're using, layout, for finds what the criteria are. It just, to me, it was easier as I looked at it to build something that way. And in the past, I have built RESTful APIs for FileMaker, and they're okay. But I think that I just kind of preferred this particular style. So I hope that answered that question. So Edwin asked, so using a middleware app between the client and the database is good practice. Do you want to answer that one, Paul?
Well, I mean, I think we're both probably on the same page with that. I mean, it can be a good practice. It's often better because, like I mentioned before, it's more resilient. It gives you better separation so that, multiple apps can more conveniently not be hitting the database directly and, maybe causing performance problems there. It lets you, like Tim said, put load balancing in front of stuff maybe a little easier than you could in front of the database directly. So it's a pretty common design pattern. You see it a lot. It's more scalable. It's more flexible. So, I mean, overall, yeah, it is a good practice. And not that, a direct client server connection is a bad practice, but it does have some other limitations.
Yeah, I think also, we talked about how you developed 3 different types of apps in your part of the demo, and they all were essentially hitting the same instance of Temper. I mean, they all were. So just imagine in a production environment where you had apps that are completely different from what Paul showed you. For example, it may be calls coming out of something like NetSuite, for example, which I mentioned earlier. It could be completely other systems making those API calls in, systems that don't have a way to connect via ODBC. And then, Paul, I'll give you a plug here, but eventually with Xojo, you're going to be able to create Android apps as well, which, hopefully in the future we'll have you just create one of those and just hit Temper, just like you did with the iOS side. So it really opens up a world of possibilities, and you've essentially got a single interface to the data, and one that you can kind of control from a security standpoint, from a governance standpoint, and so on. So I think it's worth looking at this approach.
All makes sense to me.
Any other questions? I think there's something in the chat.
Yeah, is there?
Bill was saying that he's found that the ODBC connection fails for his FileMaker server. That when it fails, FileMaker server crashed. Yeah, I know that ODBC can be temperamental, and it really depends on, and FileMaker server is kind of temperamental in and of itself at times, but but that is a very good point. Paul mentioned earlier that the ODBC connection can easily, go down on you. In which case you're kind of dead in the water. That's not to say that Temper isn't going to go down or that you're going to have some kind of networking issue further upstream, but there's a lot of different things that you could do. We talked about load balancing, but one of the things that you could do is actually have multiple instances of Temper running at different data centers and different locations and so on. So you can start to build some redundancy in depending on the architecture that you are going for. Marcus had a question. When you get and edit a FileMaker record, is the record then locked for a time? No, actually, when you send an edit request through Temper, it actually just happens. In other words, it will make the change and commit it. Now, one of the things you can see, which I didn't demonstrate, is if somebody's in FileMaker and they're sitting on a record and they've started to modify it, but they haven't committed their changes yet, and Temper tries to make a call in to edit that same record, you will get an error back indicating that the record is in use. Just like you would if you tried to do the same thing through FileMaker itself. You had 2 users trying to edit the same record, and one of them has essentially put a lock on it because they're making changes and the record's kind of dirty. It hasn't been committed yet. The same idea. Let's see. How secure is the connection? So Edwin is asking about the security of the connection, and I think in particular with regards to the European privacy laws. Yeah, I think everybody's starting to get a little bit nervous with regards to everything, right? Everything security related. I don't think that what we're showing here is any different from anything else with regards to security. You obviously want to put run temper on HTTPS. I would still recommend putting, if you don't already have FileMaker server running with a certificate. Anything you can do to secure everything up and downstream, I certainly would. As far as data or security goes on the FileMaker side, I think there's plenty of resources out there on that. On the temper side, it's not like the data is ever, in cache or anything like that. So yeah, I don't really see any issues on that side. Paul, do you have anything to add on that one, just in general?
No, same sort of stuff. I mean, in this case, it sounds like HTTPS with maybe a load balancer in front, probably the way most people would go. But I mean, most of the security also is coming on the FileMaker side too, which I don't really know too much about.
Yeah, I mentioned that, that the way that temper works, and because it's XML calls, it really is using FileMaker's native security. So in terms of, authentication and authorization on the back end, if you know how to secure a FileMaker database, then you're in good shape. You saw in that particular demo that I have an account that's pretty much has access to everything. But in a production environment, I would imagine that your API, the account that you're going to use to make the API calls, is not going to have full access to the database. You probably want to limit the layouts that it is able to hit, the fields that it can hit, scripts it can run, and it's really just a matter of going in there and configuring that specific privilege set that the account has been assigned to.
To wrap up this webinar, David's last question was if the sample projects that I showed will be available. And yes, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the sample projects I showed should be posted in the next day or so. And all of you that are attending will get an email reminding of that with the link. So thanks everyone for attending. Have a great day.